Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Exercise and Physical Activity to Reduce the Risk of Falls. Today's webinar is facilitated, as always, by the Loop Fall Prevention Community of Practice. My name is Michelle Dukeman, and I am the manager for the Fall Prevention Program at Parachute. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items next, but while I do that, we'd love to see who is joining us today. If you can, please let us know your role, organization, and location in the chat box. That will give us a good sense of who is joining today. All right, time for housekeeping. During the webinar, if you have questions about the technology or general comments, please type them into the chat box. My colleague Marguerite will be monitoring this space for those types of questions. But if you have questions specifically for our presenter about their presentation and the content, please submit those through the Q&A box that appears at the bottom of the Zoom window. Questions for our presenters, our presenter will be answered at the end of the webinar. You will only be able to view questions you have asked, not questions posed by other participants. So just keep that in mind. And this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all participants in a few days, along with the link to the presentation slides. Our next webinar is on November 16th and focuses on medication considerations for fall prevention and fall-related injury. And this is the second webinar in the Move, Improve, Remove series for Fall Prevention Month. Today is the first. The series is meant to celebrate the new posters that are available for download at no cost across Canada. So if you haven't already seen them, I highly recommend checking those out. Each webinar focuses on one of the three posters calls to action: move your body, improve your health, and remove hazards. Here's a little bit more about those posters. And I'll circulate this information after the webinar as well. But the posters are available in French and English. They're targeted towards older adults, and they're designed to be posted in a variety of settings. For example, hospitals, clinic waiting rooms, pharmacies, community buildings, long-term care and retirement facilities, and anywhere else you might find them of use. Many of you on the line are already Loop members, but for those who are not, we encourage you to sign up. Loop is the no-cost online communication platform for the Fall Prevention Community of Practice, and it brings together its members from across Canada to problem solve and discuss how to implement evidence-informed and promising practices in fall prevention. You'll see just a couple of the services that Loop provides here on the slide, and as a reminder, the recording link and presentation slides will be posted on Loop in a few days. I'd like now to introduce our presenter. Dr. Tina Ziebart is an assistant professor at Western University in the School of Physical Therapy. She is also a physiotherapist and certified exercise physiologist. She graduated her undergraduate and master's from the University of Waterloo in kinesiology and received her physiotherapy degree from Western University. She completed her PhD in physical therapy at Western University as well. Tina has built her career around teaching exercise to people with osteoporosis, both through research and clinically. You can find a complete bio for Tina on Loop if you'd like to learn more. So without further ado, please take it away, Tina. I'll let you now share your screen.
Thanks so much for the great introduction, Michelle. And I've been sort of perusing the chat as well, and I'm excited to see the variety of people that we have joining us today. So I'll go ahead and start by sharing my screen here, and I will begin. So I'm hoping that this presentation will be closer to 40, maybe 45 minutes, which should leave some time to answer questions. Michelle and I were chatting a bit beforehand, and I'm not in a rush to get out of here. So if I don't make it to your question before 1 o'clock, I can stick around for a bit to make sure that you guys get answers to your questions. So I'll be talking today about physical activity and exercise for falls prevention. So let's just begin. It's no surprise that falls are serious. So falls prevention is super important. 1 out of 5 falls causes a serious injury, such as a broken bone. And as you heard in the bio, my interest is in working with people with osteoporosis. So a fall causing a broken bone is a very real possibility. So each year, 3 million older adults are treated in the emergency room for a falls injury. Over 800,000 patients a year are hospitalized because of that. 300,000 are hospitalized for a hip fracture, which leads to increased morbidity and mortality. Falls are also the most common reason for a traumatic brain injury, which I think is a wild statistic and something that I don't think we always remember as a consequence of falls. And then, of course, falls are expensive, so it's in everybody's best interest to avoid them. Reasons that people fall are previous falls, medication use, and polypharmacy. So the next talk in this series, I think, will be really valuable in learning a bit more about that. Vision and hearing impairments, diabetes because of the neuropathy. So they get some numbness in their feet and have a hard time knowing where their feet are. Arthritis because of pain. Incontinence is more so related to rushing to the bathroom. So if they're moving quickly and are unaware of their surroundings, that can lead to a fall. And then, of course, pain. Some other fall risk factors, and I took this from the study website, but I wanted to highlight specifically lower body weakness as well as difficulties with walking and balance. And of course, I'm very excited about those risk factors because that's what my talk will be addressing. And so it's very clear that lower body weakness as well as difficulties with walking and balance are clear risk factors that we can address through exercise and physical activity. Of course, we still need to be aware that vitamin D deficiency can lead to falls as well as medications, vision problems, foot pain, and then also home hazards. So again, the home hazards piece will probably be more so addressed in that remove series, but I am going to touch on it a little bit today so that we get a sort of a broad look at all of these factors that contribute to falls and how to address them. So as I mentioned, I pulled that list from the study website. And so this is Stopping Elderly Accidents, Deaths, and Injuries. If you haven't had a chance to explore this website, it's really thorough and a great resource for healthcare professionals. As I mentioned, my interest is or has been working with people with osteoporosis, and falls often lead to fractures. So this study was done as part of the lab that I work on during my PhD, so under the supervision of Dr. Joy McDermott, and looking at what factors contributed to fall-related distal radius fractures. And I was particularly interested in this because in the osteoporotic population, distal radius fractures are sometimes called the lucky break because it starts that cascade into investigating osteoporosis more thoroughly, and hopefully trying to reduce the more debilitating fractures of, say, the spine or the hip. One thing that I wanted to highlight on this table here was that we often think about falls and the consequences of falls happening in that older adult population, focusing more on that 65 plus group. But when we look at this table, the greatest number of falls were actually occurring in the 45 to 64 group, which were leading to distal radius fractures. And so the common reasons for that would be falling on ice or snow. And as we're approaching winter, and I think at least in London, we're supposed to be getting some snow this weekend. So we're approaching this fall on ice and snow season. And then as well, other falls are another huge contributor to distal radius fractures. And so falls prevention is very important, but it's not just important in an older adult population. It's also important for all adults. So we can see that there's a large proportion of people that are falling and breaking their wrist between the 25 to 44 age group, as well as the 45 to 64 group. So very important to think about falls prevention in all adults. Few more statistics. Most falls occur outdoors. Women are more likely to report an indoor fall. Indoor falls are associated with frailty, and outdoor falls are associated with compromised health in an active elderly population. So when I was working on my PhD, I was looking at people with a distal radius fracture, so those who have broken their wrist. Often it was because of falls, and it wasn't surprising that I had a huge number of people that were recruited in the winter months from slipping on ice and snow. But there was also a large number of people that I was able to recruit in the summer months, which kind of surprised me. But I think that's because of spending more time outdoors. So recently I was talking to a woman too about her desire to continue hiking. And she actually wanted to continue hiking in the winter. And I was like, maybe we should save that one for the summer when you can see the roots and leaves and all of that uneven ground underneath you. But I think that's why outdoor falls are a huge factor. But we also have to be worried about sort of those active elderly. Not that we're discouraging activity, but it can be a reason why people fall as well. So falling is, again, a huge concern, and part of it is because it can lead to this decrease in mobility. And so somebody will fall, then they'll become afraid of falling, then they'll have a more cautious gait, which increases their risk of falling, which leads to a fall, which increases their fear of falling, and the cycle continues. And so we get really concerned about them decreasing their mobility, becoming more sedentary, spending more time indoors, and therefore overall declining health. So although being active can sometimes be a reason people fall, it's something we still want to encourage. And if that's something that's important to them, we can figure out strategies on decreasing the risk of falls by, say, improving their balance and their strength. So how do we break the cycle? Well, first off, we need to identify these fall risk factors that I just explained to you. And then, of course, exercise and physical activity is a great intervention to try to help break this cycle, reduce the risk of falling, but also hopefully reduce that fear of falling. So encouraging these adults to become active again. So I wanted to share with you a few fall screening tests, and these are more so related to physical function that would be great to use sort of in your clinic. I saw a lot of physiotherapists, occupational therapists, and kinesiologists, and as well just some screening tests to make you aware of. So one of my favorite is the sit to stand test. So that's where they're sitting on a chair. Their arms are crossed, so they're trying not to use their hands to stand up. They stand all the way up and then they sit down again. And so what we're doing is we're counting the number of repetitions that they can do in 30 seconds. So a high risk of falling is if they get less than 8 sit to stands in 30 seconds, and a moderate risk of falling would be less than 14 in individuals over the age of 50, excuse me. So this is a great test to measure lower extremity strength as well as endurance, and it can be done pretty much anywhere. All you need is a chair and a stopwatch, which can be your phone these days, and then it only takes 30 seconds. So a really great way to look at that fall risk, but also looking at lower extremity strength and endurance. The timed up and go test is a really common test for screening for falls, and it's a great one because it's also a bit of a composite measure. So we're looking at lower extremity strength because they stand up from a chair, they walk 3 meters around a line or a pylon sometimes, and then they sit back down again. So we're also looking at changing direction and obstacle avoidance, which are all factors that can contribute to falls. So if they complete this in less than 10 seconds, there's a low fall risk. If they complete it in less than 20 seconds, it's a moderate fall risk. And if it's between 20 and 30 seconds, it's a high fall risk, and greater than 30 seconds is a very high fall risk. So we just want, so again, a really easy test to conduct. It can be done sort of in a clinic, in a waiting room, in an office. You need a chair, measure out that 3 meters, and then again, a stopwatch. And it's a really quick, easy way to screen somebody for their functional ability as well as their risk for falls. The 4-stage balance test, again, a really accessible test to be able to use kind of anywhere. And so what this one does is measure your balance, but in a graded way. So you would start with your feet together and see if they can hold it for 10 seconds. Then you start in then you progress to a semi-tandem stand, which would be having your heel beside your toe. And then you would go to a tandem stand, which is having your heel in front of your toe. And then you would go to a one-legged stand. So they're at a very high risk of falling if their one-legged stance is under 5 seconds. The forward reach test, I think this one's a little more unique. Less people are familiar with it, but I think it's a really, really good one for looking at, again, that functional risk for falling. So what this test is you have somebody standing against a wall, and then you're seeing how far they can reach their arm forward while keeping their feet planted on the ground. And so this test, I think, is really great because a lot of people fall in their homes and probably while they're reaching to do something. So putting a bowl in the cupboard up top, or trying to grab the sugar from the cupboard, or leaning over a countertop to grab something. So again, a really functional way, but can lead to that increased risk of fall because we are shifting our center of mass towards the edge of our limits of our base of support. And so if they can reach 25 centimeters without that risk of fall, that fear of falling, then it's a low risk of falls. 15 to 25 centimeters is a 2 times greater than normal risk of falls. And if it's less than 15 centimeters, then there's a 4 times greater risk of falls. And if they're actually unwilling to do this test, it's an 8 times greater risk of falling. So a really, again, easy way. All you need is a measuring tape taped to your wall. You have them standing there and see how far they can reach forward. So another really functional and easy way to measure their balance. The Berg balance test, I think, is again a little bit more commonly known, and it's a nice composite of static and dynamic balance on a 14-item scale. And so this is useful for evaluating multiple fall risks in the community. And so the likelihood of falls increases as the score decreases. And so it can also discriminate those between Parkinson's who've fallen and those who don't fall. So this test is really nice because it's been really well evaluated in the literature and research. Of course, screening tests do have their limitations, and so screening for falls may actually increase their fear of falling. So we need to be cautious about that and why we're doing this screening of falls and how we communicate it with the person that we're screening. Falls are multifactorial, as we know. So we saw that huge list of risk factors for falls. And so no one scale captures all of these aspects. And so these tests haven't all been tested in a wide range of populations and settings, so it may not be applicable to your group. And then there may be some uncertainty around these predictive scores. So we also have to be a little bit careful about how we're interpreting these scales. Most of them are validated for older adults, so over the age of 65, not so much for the 50 to 65 group, or even the 45. So we sort of forget about those younger people who are still at risk of falling. When it comes to interventions, I pulled this again from the study website. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we can see that there's lots of great literature out there. I wanted to pull this so that you have access to it when I send you the slides. So you've got references on some really, really nice exercise programs that can help to reduce the risk of falling. And so we're looking at some resistance training exercises, some multimodal type of exercises, as well as some more dynamic balance exercises like Tai Chi. And I'll get into those interventions a little bit more so as we go on. There's also some interventions related to home modifications, so reducing the risk of falls through identifying home hazards. And I'll explain a study that I conducted related to that, but I'll leave the bulk of that to our Remove presentation later in the month. And then there have been some more clinical interventions. So looking at medications, a lot of these are focusing on more like a vitamin D, which again, I'll leave to the next talk on the Improve one. Multifaceted interventions again, so looking at a combination of strength training and balance training. My intention of this wasn't to go through it thoroughly, but to provide you with some references on some really great interventions that are available. So next, I wanted to draw your attention to the exercise guidelines. So these guidelines were created by the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, and these ones were specifically created for older adults. So if you haven't kept up with these guidelines were created in 2001, I believe, and 2021, sorry. So really recently, looking at a 24-hour day. So they used to just talk about exercise, but now these guidelines also emphasize sleep and sedentary behavior. What I wanted to highlight on these recommendations, which is unique to the older adult guidelines and is not included in the 18 to 65 group, is that they recommend activities that challenge your balance. So if you look under that sort of green physical activity column, they recommend moderate to vigorous aerobic physical activity for at least 150 minutes per week, which aligns with the adult guidelines, as well as muscle strengthening, which works each of the major muscle groups at least twice a week. So that aligns as well. What's unique to the older adult guidelines is that we then encourage physical activity to challenge balance. And so, of course, this is super valuable and important when it comes to exercise prescription for older adults. And the intention of this is really to try to reduce the risk of falling. And so if you haven't reviewed these guidelines, it's worth taking a look, especially if you are working with older adults who are interested in exercising, to make sure that they're meeting these guidelines. There are also osteoporosis exercise guidelines. And so I'm going to go over these, but they've also come out with new clinical guidelines for osteoporosis, and I'll review that next. But what's interesting with the osteoporosis guidelines is that they emphasize strength training over aerobic exercise. So the way that this table was created was intentional to put strength training at the top. The dosage is the same, so that we're still encouraging older adults to exercise at least 2 days a week, training each of the major muscle groups, and really working in a zone to increase strength. They also encourage balance exercises, but in these guidelines, there's a bit more around that prescription. So you can see that 8 to 12 repetitions for strength training, and then they actually encourage balance exercises every single day. And when you look at the literature for how much balance exercise is needed, they recommend about 20 minutes per day, which is a lot, but you can actually combine some exercises. So for example, like a lunge can be a really challenging exercise for strength, and it also works on balance. So somebody can do both strength training and balance to try to meet those 20 minutes of balance exercise training. They also recommend things like Tai Chi or dancing or walking on your toes or your heels. So doing some balance and walking patterns to challenge your balance. Uniquely to the osteoporosis guidelines is postural awareness. This is primarily to help to reduce the risk of vertebral fractures, so spine fractures. But I think it's also really valuable for older adults in general to be mindful of their posture, because that change in posture can shift their center of mass closer to the edge of the base of support, which can then increase their risk of falling. So being mindful of their posture, I think, is a good takeaway from these guidelines that are applicable not just to an osteoporotic population, but to older adults more broadly. The last component of these guidelines are those aerobic physical activities, and it aligns with the older adult guidelines, suggesting at least 150 minutes per week. But for people with osteoporosis, we say that if you don't have enough time to fit all of this in, aerobic exercise is actually the lowest priority, and you should be prioritizing your strength and balance exercise. And as we saw leading up to these guidelines, that it's very important to work on building your strength and your balance. And that's why it's prioritized, because for somebody with osteoporosis who falls, the consequences are more likely to be a broken bone. So we're really working on trying to prevent that. So these new clinical guidelines for osteoporosis, I think, are actually really great. So if you haven't read them yet, they were recently published sort of at the start of the month. And what I really like about them is that there is a lot more on this non-pharmacological management, really looking at that strength, nutrition, and balance piece. And so you can see that there's a bit of a decision tree going on here. And so there's a lot more guidance on when to recommend pharmacotherapy versus trying non-pharmacotherapy. And so they actually suggest for every single person, postmenopausal males and females, which I think is really nice that they emphasize the males in this, over the age of 50, everybody should be doing a balance and muscle strengthening exercise program at least twice a week, as well as encourage them to eat foods rich in calcium and protein, and making sure that they're getting sufficient vitamin D, likely needed through supplementation, since we live in Canada and it's pretty gloomy here for many months of the year. So I think that's great that the top of the decision tree is really looking at these non-pharmacological interventions that are valuable for everybody. And then as we start to make these more clinical decisions, then we might get into the pharmacotherapy, which is outside of my scope of practice and outside of sort of the purpose of this talk. But I just really wanted to highlight the value here in strength and balance training. And it's great that it's now being recognized in clinical guidelines as well. So going on to some of the interventions that I wanted to highlight, home interventions are very good because we spend so much time in our homes. So even the best exercise programs in the community are probably only a couple of hours a week. And so I think these home interventions are really nice. And so this was a randomized controlled trial looking at falls prevention strategies in older adults. And what was really cool about this trial was that they were looking at many of these factors that can contribute to falls, including hypotension, visual acuity. And so they found that there was no difference between the groups that received these interventions. But I wanted to highlight this study because it really shows that falls are multifactorial. So just doing an exercise intervention may not help reduce the risk of falls or the risk of recurring falls, because we do have to address some of these other factors as well. So trying to pull it all together is important. And an exercise intervention that just focuses on strength training may not be enough for falls prevention. So we do need to continue to challenge your balance. And so that can be through static or dynamic balance. And so static is typically easier, and then progress to dynamic. Or you can do a static exercise with reduced support if somebody is feeling particularly challenged with their balance. Or you can do a static exercise that reduces their senses, which is a nice way to try to challenge these other systems that contribute to balance. So having them stand with their feet together, but closing their eyes. or having them stand with their feet together and then shaking their head no or yes to challenge that vestibular system. And then, or you can also make it more challenging by doing a static balance challenge with a mental challenge. And so I think addressing each one of these types of progressions is very valuable because they each sort of have their time and place. So having reduced senses or changing your senses is really helpful for people that get up and have to use the washroom in the middle of the night. So when the lights are darker, is their balance still okay? Adding in a mental challenge is really helpful too for the people that walk outside and they're having a conversation with somebody that takes a mental load. So is their balance still good in those situations? So the way that we sometimes train that one with a mental challenge is by having the older adults stand maybe with their feet together, stand on one foot, so a static balance exercise, and then having them count backwards from 100 by sevens. So something a little bit more challenging that takes that load on. The other thing that I'll sometimes have them do is practice a static balance exercise while having a conversation with somebody. So again, a mental load added on to this balance exercise. And so we mentioned too that Tai Chi is another great exercise to work on dynamic balance. And so Tai Chi has been shown to have significant improvements in fall rates. And when comparing Tai Chi to non-exercise, there was a reduction of 21% of falls in the Tai Chi group. So overall, it's been seen that Tai Chi can significantly and clinically reduce fall rates. So it's a really nice intervention that could be used. When also looking at the home area, some of the major problems in areas where people fall are on the outside steps to the entrance, the inside stairs to a second floor, or having unsafe bathrooms. So like I said, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this section, but I do think it's valuable to start to understand where older adults are falling, and then thinking about how we might use exercise interventions to help to address some of these. So in my subsequent slides, I'll be talking about how we could evaluate some of these home hazards. But as we're looking here, thinking a little bit more on that physical activity and exercise piece, doing exercises like step-ups or lateral lunges or lunges, you can see would have huge value in training older adults to work on that single leg balance, which they need to be able to climb stairs or step in and out of their bathtub or climb downstairs. And so challenging that or building that up in a more controlled environment can then translate really nicely into the home. So identifying fall hazards is a great strategy to also help to reduce falls, since a lot of adults spend a lot of time in their home. So the gold standard would be a therapist visits the home, assesses the home fall hazards. But given COVID, as well as the accessibility of having a therapist enter the home, can be a little bit challenging. So one study was looking at home hazard identification, and they showed that an exercise intervention helped, as well as identifying these home fall hazards helped to reduce the rate of falls. So my theme is that falls are multifactorial. So providing an exercise intervention is great, but also trying to reduce the risk of home fall hazards is also very important. So if we can address some of these fall risk factors from multiple points of view, then we stand a better chance of reducing the risk of falls for the future. So another study that I did was looking at a meta-analysis of identifying home fall hazards to see if we could reduce the risk of falls. And so looking just at home hazards didn't seem to have a difference in reducing falls. And so, but complementing it with an exercise program does show promise. So another study that we did to try to increase the accessibility of identifying these home fall hazards was to use a GoPro video. But I also think it would be possible to use like a cell phone video. So you could have somebody, one of your clients, take you on a little tour of their home, and especially focusing on areas that you know increase the risk of falling. So looking in their bathroom to see whether or not they have a grab bar, if they've got mats that are secured, taking a look in their kitchen, looking at their front entrances to see whether or not they have railings or if there's enough contrast on their stairs to be able to see the steps to reduce the risk of falling. So some really simple ways to try to modify the home, and then complementing that with an exercise program that addresses lower extremity strength and balance. So now getting into sort of the meat and potatoes is looking at these structured exercise programs. So a systematic review of 8 articles looked at the following types of interventions. So resistance and aerobic exercise, just balance training, wobble board and T-bow training, aerobic exercise, stability training, some adapted physical activity, and some We Fit training. And the studies that were looking at the balance measures did show improvements compared to baseline assessments. So this structured supervised exercise program that seems to address sort of fitness and falls prevention from a few different aspects, like strength training, aerobic training, and balance training, did show improvements in balance. And so again, just highlighting some of the stats here. So the experimental group increased their balance outcome measures significantly compared to the control group. And so when looking at the types of interventions that they did, many of the studies were looking at 2 or 3 times per week for anywhere from 10 minutes to 90 minutes. So it's super reassuring to think that some wobble board training for 10 minutes can substantially increase the single leg balance in that experimental group. So it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time. So 90 minutes doesn't necessarily have to be the gold standard there. We can see some improvement in just even small bouts of exercise. So again, looking at another review on aging sarcopenia. Sarcopenia, recall, is a decrease in muscle mass. Falls and resistance training. And so with this study, I wanted to highlight some of the dosage that they were using. So the strength training was performed 2 to 3 times per week for 2 to 3 sets, and then 1 to 2 exercises for each of the major muscle groups, trying to get to about 70 to 85% of the 1 RM. So that seemed to be the optimal dosage to try to reduce the risk of falls in community dwelling older adults. And so again, this last blurb here is just looking at the types of exercises that were performed. So using exercises that resembled everyday tasks, such as getting up from a chair, putting weights on the shelves, getting up from the floor, walking in the hallway. So very functional type of exercises, but doing those types of exercises 3 sessions per week for 12 weeks at 4 to 8 repetitions showed increases in strength and power, provided there was some progressive intensity. And so really great way to help to increase the strength and the function to try to help to reduce the risk of falls, especially in the home. And so, as I mentioned, exercise for people with osteoporosis is my area of expertise. And recently, studies have started to explore more resistance training for osteoporosis. And I think there was a little bit of a mental shift to say that resistance training can be safe for people with osteoporosis. So with good form, it seems to be a good option to attenuate bone loss. So still exercise isn't showing to increase bone mineral density, but we can try to keep bone mineral density the same. And in the studies that have started to explore resistance training for people with osteoporosis, there have been very few reported adverse events. And the studies have ranged from more home functional type exercises, doing things like sit to stands, calf raises, to something a little more intense by using like barbells, for example. And so the applicability of who gets what type of exercise prescription will require some clinical reasoning, but there's definitely value in conducting resistance training to not only help to increase that lower extremity strength, improve posture, but hopefully also try to improve balance and ultimately reduce the risk of falling. There are also several community programs that I wanted to highlight. And so one of them is the VON SMART program. And so this is a senior group exercise program that's offered to community members completely for free who want to increase their strength, balance, and mobility through low impact exercises. And so these exercises are facilitated by fitness instructors and volunteers. And the dosage for this type of program is it's typically a 12-week program lasting about 45 minutes, focusing on strength and balance. Each district that runs one of these programs has some leniency to be able to develop the program how they want to. And so before referring your patients out to a community program, just vet it a little bit to see whether or not it'll be challenging enough. Some of the programs that I looked at, they spend quite a bit of time doing chair exercises. And I always hesitate to send older adults to doing chair exercises because it's not going to challenge their balance. So maybe not the best program for falls prevention. And so we do need to continue to challenge their balance to improve their balance. And so just being mindful of the type of programs that are available. But it's a really, really great option because it's free. And then there's lots of these programs sort of around. So you could take a look at what's offered in your community and see if this might be a good option as a community resource. In the London area, something that I run is an osteoporosis group exercise class. And so this is a 6-week program. It's a small group exercise class. And so I take on 8 people per class. And we work on posture, core, lower body strength, upper body strength, balance. And then I do try to personalize it a little bit. So for those individuals that come in with a lot more exercise experience, we challenge them a little bit more versus those who are either newer to exercise or a little more deconditioned, then we keep things a little bit easy. One thing I will highlight is that when it comes to the core exercises and some of even the upper body and lower body exercises, I do get all of my participants to get to the ground. And so some people are very hesitant to get to the ground, but I always remind them that we don't always choose getting to the ground. So in a fall prevention talk, I think it's very important to recognize that falls aren't always by choice. They're probably never by choice, but it is important to be able to have that strength and the knowledge to be able to get up from a fall so that there aren't bigger consequences there. And so I always encourage my participants to develop that skill of building the strength or using their resources to be able to pull themselves up from the ground. And so far, so good. So some people are a little bit hesitant, but overall, it seems well received. And so for the lower body strength as well, I wanted to highlight that we really do, well, for this whole exercise, some of them, we are really challenging them. And I think that's important too, is to try to maybe push it a little bit harder to make sure that people are working to a point that's challenging for them. So I'll get some of my my participants to do like lunges, or if you're familiar with Bulgarian split squats. So those are quite challenging. It's where you have your foot on the back of a chair. So it's a really one foot on the back of the chair, one foot in front, and then you're kind of doing lunges that way, but it ends up becoming more of like a single leg lunge. So it becomes really, really challenging. It works the balance really nicely, but it also really challenges these people, which means that they're increasing their strength, which is what we want to do. For the upper body strength, I get some of them doing push-ups. So again, a pretty challenging exercise, but a great way to work on your core, your upper body strength, and a little bit of that coordination. So I do try to challenge my people, and these are all individuals who have osteoporosis, so we're mindful about the form, but it's definitely possible to push them. Another program that we have running through the community, these two programs are both offered in London, but I think there's other programs, especially like the GLAD program, that's offered in other communities. And so this is a nice education and neuromuscular exercise program to offload stresses of the knees and the hip joints. And that helps to create stability, decrease pain, and increase function. And as we saw sort of earlier on in the talk, a risk factor for falling is arthritis. And part of that is due to that alignment, but also pain. And so again, a 6-week program that runs twice a week for about an hour. And it does provide education on the pathology of osteoarthritis, as well as a progressive exercise program. This program primarily focuses on the lower extremity. So another really nice option to provide to some of your patients. The last piece that I wanted to touch on is sport, because a lot of adults do enjoy sport, but I find a lot of older adults are eager to get to playing sports in their retirement. And so there is a positive association with those who practice leisure sports and falling. So in those who played leisurely sports, there was a 99% chance less of a fall. So at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that those outdoor activities can sometimes lead to a fall. But what we can see is it's not worth it to stop doing those activities, because they can actually help to improve your balance and your strength, and therefore decrease your risk of falling. So leisure time physical activities were really great for decreasing the risk of falls. And this is particularly related to people who are inactive. So we really want to encourage people to get active. So get active and stay active, because exercise and balance and strengthening are all great tools to try to reduce your risk of falling. That's what I have for you guys today. As promised, I've got about 15 minutes left to answer any questions you might have. So thank you guys so much, and I hope you learned something.
Thanks so much, Tina. That was a really fantastic presentation. I've had a little bit of everything, which I love. The research side, the practical side, and then some info sharing on what's available both nationally, but also within the Ontario provinces. I know a lot of Loop members are from Ontario. I hope those who are not Ontario based, you were able to pull some good nuggets from that as well. I will just remind folks that if you have questions, we do have some questions in the Q&A box that we'll start to get to, but if you do have questions for Tina, please put them there in the Q&A rather than the chat. Another reminder, some of you who have attended our webinars before know that when the webinar ends, a evaluation survey will automatically pop up. So please do fill that out. We review all of those results on an ongoing basis, and they feed into continuous improvement of these webinars. So we love to hear from you in that way. But I will move on to the Q&A now. And maybe I'll share my screen. I have a slide with your contact information and stuff, Tina. So I'll put that up in case people want to jot that down. But our first question is, many cutoffs exist for physical capacity tests. Should we now use the latest WHO tug and walking speed guidelines?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and thank you for that. And it's a bit of a tricky question to answer. So there are many cutoffs that exist, and part of the reason for that is looking at the different populations. So the populations can get quite specific. So maybe you're looking at Parkinson's or stroke or older adults in general, but then you look at different age categories as well. So I would start by making sure that the cutoff scores that you're looking at reflect the population that you're applying them to. But if using the latest research from like the World Health Organization is definitely a great option for sure. Anything that's sort of newer and updated is always good. As we start to develop more information, we can pool more results together and get more accurate results. So that's really helpful. And then tug and walking speed guidelines are really great measures for not only falls prevention, but also for lower extremity strength. So the short answer to your question is yes. And the long answer would be to just be a bit more mindful about which population you're looking at to make sure that it's applicable.
Awesome. Thanks, Tina. All right, our next question is, I find those who sustain a neuro-based injury, such as a brain injury, benefit from the same guidelines as those set for older adults. However, the marketing is based on age, which may mean many are not benefiting from this information. Any work being considered to market for a broader range of individuals? And this may not be your expertise, so don't worry, Tina.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so another great question. Thank you so much for putting that in. And I agree. I think that there's a component where a specific population is helpful because there are unique challenges for the neuro-based group that maybe older adults don't necessarily experience for those who haven't experienced a neurological condition. So I think that there is definitely work being considered for a broader range of individuals, like looking at older adults in general. But there's also some sort of more specific guidelines to work with those more clinical populations. Another great question, but definitely depends on the population that you're working with and the emphasis of the research. So there's definitely limitations to research and how much is done and which groups are doing it. Yeah.
Thanks. The next question is, what resources do you have? I would say, what resources, if there are any that you know about, regarding fall prevention with older adults with dementia in the physical activity space?
Yeah. I'm not super familiar with the dementia realm, so I do apologize for that. I think the considerations do need to be unique because dementia brings in so many bigger complex issues. Maybe that's why I've stayed away from it, because it's kind of a tough population to work with, but very valuable. So I don't have resources off the top of my head for that one. I'm sorry.
No problem. All right. Another participant asks, why support chair exercise programs if the goal is to reduce the risk of falls?
Yeah, I think some of it relates more to policy and so like local policy, as well as how much risk the institution is willing to take on. So I think sometimes they encourage these chair exercises for people who are at risk of falling because it'll reduce the risk of falling, which is always a great thing for an exercise program because they don't want to have to deal with somebody who's fallen. But it's definitely it's a little bit counterintuitive because then they're not necessarily challenging their strength or their balance to their highest potential. So sometimes what I've seen people do is have chairs available as a balanced support piece, like being able to hold on to the back of the chair, but not doing the exercise classes in a seated position. So instead having the person stand while doing the exercises, but allowing them to hold on to a chair for support.
Great. All right, the next question we might need some more context, but it says, does the CCAA run classes?
So for the context, the CCAA is the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging. It's hosted out of Western University, and it used to run classes, but right now, since COVID, the classes have been shut down and they've been moved to the community centres in London. So the exercise instructors who used to be teaching classes out of the CCAA are now all working for the City of London. So there's community centres in London that are running exercise classes for older adults and for falls prevention. So some good resources out in the community in London.
Awesome. All right, the next question, yeah, a good one. They ask, what are some strategies for people to safely lower themselves to the ground for exercises? And I guess in the other side of the coin would be safely getting up as well.
Yeah, so that's another one that I actually like to use a chair as more of a prop to help them. And so the strategy that I typically use is to get into sort of a lunge position, to step back and kneel down onto one knee, then on both knees, and then being able to sort of roll yourself to your hip, your shoulder, and then onto your back. And so it's a really great way to try to keep your spine neutral while lowering yourself onto the ground, which is important for people with osteoporosis, but also a really great way to work on building up that strength in that extremity. So using the chair as a little bit of support that you can maybe drive through your arms, but still developing that leg strength. It becomes a little bit challenging when we look at people who have had like a joint replacement, who don't feel super comfortable kneeling on their knee, or they might have restricted range of motion because of that joint replacement or for other reasons. So there may be a little bit of troubleshooting that needs to happen there. I find the people who have had joint replacements that are just nervous to put the pressure on it, I put one of those really thick foam mats underneath, and that seems to help. And then the other thing is I'll sometimes just let people do their own thing to try to get up and down from the ground, definitely supervising them to for safety. But I call it like the baby giraffe, where they kind of keep their legs really straight and they try to hinge from their hips, and then they kind of like shimmy themselves down. Not always the most graceful, but I think it is a nice practice skill to have anyways. So sometimes you compromise grace for being able to practice getting up and down from the ground. So hopefully that answers that.
All right, next question. Lots of questions, which is awesome. People are very interested and very engaged. So we'll keep plowing through them. And the next one is, you have mentioned the benefits found from these exercise programs and interventions. Can you speak to the need to maintain exercise to maintain benefits and improvements versus just 6 to 12-week sessions?
Such a great question. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think that's a huge limitation when we are looking at research, is that it is always for such a finite period of time. Whereas older adults really should be practicing, or adults in general, like if you're in that 45 and older group, you guys should all be doing exercises to work on balance as well. And that does need to be for sort of an infinite amount of time. So as we continue to age, we need to continue to maintain our balance and maintain our strength. So we need to continue to do these exercises afterwards. In my exercise class that I run here in London, which is only 6 weeks, I provide them with a resource and encourage them to be able to do these exercises at home. So the way that I frame my class is that these 6 weeks are here to help you learn how to do the exercise, learn from me on how to progress the exercises safely, but the intention is that you carry this on at home. So here are the resources that I can provide you to be able to continue this at home, and please keep going and doing this twice a week forever. that's kind of the yeah.
Awesome. All right, the next question is, do you use the PAR-Q and or the PAR-Q Med X prior to programs?
Yeah, I do. I do use the PAR-Q. As a physiotherapist, I'm able to sort of gauge it a little bit more when I do an intake form on their readiness to exercise. If you're a kinesiologist or an exercise professional, I would definitely rely on a PAR-Q or a PAR-Q Med-X to be able to screen for exercise readiness. Another thing that I've done that's sort of helped to gauge that legal side of thing, but also the like exercise readiness, is to get referrals from physicians. So if you're able to get referrals from physicians, then usually the physician can screen them for an exercise program to be able to say that they're ready for it. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Another interesting question. At the community level of group balance training, where would flexibility training be in order of importance in the programming?
So based on how much I spoke about that, clearly my own personal bias is low. I don't focus a whole lot on the flexibility training. And I think part of that is because of my bias working with people with osteoporosis. And I've always sort of prioritized the strength training. There's definitely value in flexibility training. And it's something that I need to reflect on more as a professional myself, to incorporate more flexibility training. And related to that, like there is huge value in like yoga classes, and working on that. So you can get some really, really nice balance exercises in there, while being able to work on range of motion and getting some strength. I know that even when I do yoga classes after taking a bit of a hiatus, I'm always pretty sore afterwards. So yoga is a really, really great way to work on your strength, your balance, and your range of motion. Yeah, and in the group chat, Pilates also is a great way to do that. So I've always sort of geared away from Pilates personally because of my work with people with osteoporosis, and we really try to avoid spinal flexion. But modifying exercises so that they're safe for the population that you're working with, you can get really nice bang for your buck for some of these like yoga and Pilates classes. So when it comes to flexibility training, I think I focus more so on strength through the range as opposed to purely static hold exercises, and probably more a personal bias as opposed to true like recommendations. So hopefully that's clear.
That's great. Thank you. All right, the next question, they start off by thanking you for a comprehensive presentation. So thank you. And then they ask, could you give some examples for cognitive assessment and training that you might have been using?
Yeah, I don't focus a whole lot on the dementia world or cognitive evaluation. Yeah, as a physiotherapist, we've sort of delegated that to OTs as well. So I don't have a whole lot of clinical experience with it. And then as a researcher, I'm focusing on osteoporosis. So the cognitive piece isn't huge in my world. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
No problem at all. That's a fine answer. The next question is, I see on social media, and they say that I am an OT, the exercise of trying to get up from the floor without using your hands for, quote, younger, older adults, and sometimes info on risks/outcomes, etc. If you can't do this, what are your thoughts on this generally, if you have any?
So yeah, I think that there's definitely value in trying to figure out how to get up from the ground without using your hands. Not always do older adults fall right next to a chair that's conveniently located to help them get up again. So I think it's important to be able to figure out how to stand up sort of from the middle of a room. That's not always feasible for people. So I think using a chair or using your hands to help to get yourself up as you're learning how to redevelop that strength and confidence and being able to stand is really helpful. So yeah, there's definitely risks for doing it without your hands because it does challenge the balance and strength so much. So you do have to, it does require a little bit of clinical reasoning, seeing the person that's in front of you, and then balancing the risks and benefits. For me, the risk of that fear of getting to the ground definitely is not worth the benefits of learning that skill. But that's where I'm not super stubborn about providing them with chairs as a prop or allowing them to use their hands to get up, because I do want to work on building confidence, building strength, building balance, and then we can gradually progress it once we've created that foundation.
Great. All right, I'm just going to remind those on the line, thanks for still being with us. We do have some more questions to get through, but you are welcome to hop off if you need to, because we're going to keep recording as we go through the rest of these questions. It'll probably take another 5 or 10 minutes, but the questions that are still here will get answered on the recording. So thank you again for joining us, and please do fill out the evaluation survey. And thank you to those who are still online. We'll go to our next question. Jeanette asks, are there online exercise groups for osteoporosis that you know about?
I don't know about them right now. It's definitely a goal of mine to work on developing as part of my research. But for now, the group exercise class that I offer is in person.
No problem. Alrighty. The next question, kind of a follow-up to the getting up off the ground, and it may be the same advice about that thick mat, but they ask, how do you get someone to the ground who has had a double knee replacement?
Yeah, so the thick mat is definitely one of the things that I'll use. And then sometimes getting them to the ground isn't like a day one thing. It can be something that I will ease them into a little bit, again, to work on building that confidence. And so one thing that I have spent a lot of time working on is developing like their strength in squats, and that helps to increase their range of motion. So as long as they can get their knee to about 90 degrees, they'll have the range of motion to get to the ground. You can also work on sensitizing the knee by having them kneel on a chair, or doing some work around sensitizing the scar, if that's what their concern is. But I've noticed anecdotally that a lot of it is more about a confidence piece. And so if you can gradually build that up by having them do some sit to stands to develop the strength, increase their range of motion in their knee, and then sensitize the knee through kneeling on a chair or something else, that can sometimes work.
All right. The next question is, you mentioned that these physical performance measures aren't holistic/comprehensive of falls risk. Are there any other measures out there that are more holistic in nature that can be used to screen for falls? They mentioned that they came across the CGA, but not sure if something else exists.
Yeah, there are definitely some holistic ones. I would say it's probably not possible to address every issue just because falls are so complex. And so as we listen to the next talks in this series, you'll notice that things like vision and vestibular concerns, as well as that pharmacological management, can sometimes be outside of the scope of what we're addressing here. So I think sometimes that integration between non-pharmacological interventions and pharmacological interventions sometimes miss the mark. But in the presentation, I'll send you that list of exercises and interventions that have been conducted, and some of them are multimodal that do address sort of that non-pharmacological piece from different angles, or they'll start to work on balance, strength, as well as improving vision. So there are interventions that are out there for sure.
An anecdotal question. Have you ever had someone on the ground who couldn't get up, and what did you do to get them up?
Yeah, of course it happens where somebody has a bad day where they've been able to get to the ground like every week leading up to this point, and then all of a sudden they're just like, today's not the day. I try my best to talk them through it and try to keep them calm, because I think that fear clicks in really quickly when they're kind of stuck on the ground. So I did have somebody who used a walker as a gait aid. And even then I still made her get to the ground during my exercise class, just because, again, we don't always have that choice of getting to the ground. And that day, I think she was just feeling particularly sore and tired. So I talked her through it mostly, and then provided just a little bit of support sort of under her arms, but mostly just guiding her to say, okay, remember, now you're getting yourself into that lunge, so swing that leg forward, hold yourself against the chair, push through there, drive through the hips. So sometimes it's facilitating through that hip drive. Sometimes it's, supporting them under the arms, or yeah, so I still try to make them do what they can to get up independently as much as possible. And then I just facilitate where I feel like that sort of crack in the link is.
The next question deals with dementia and cognition again, so I'm actually going to skip it just because we not the topic of discussion for today. The next person asks, I have a client who had a hip fracture from completing sit to stand in August, and the hip is still not fully healed, but has improved and alignment remains. What kind of exercise would you recommend to this client, considering that resistance training is important for those with osteoporosis?
Yeah, that's tricky. And it's unfortunate for your client who had a fracture from sitting or working on sit to stands. So without trying to be too specific and giving advice on a client that I haven't assessed, I would start in either easier exercises or reduced range of motion. So some exercises that I'll like doing will try to maybe isolate specific muscle groups, maybe like a standing hip flexion, hip abduction, or hip extension. And those are nice to sort of isolate the muscle, but they can be sort of self-limiting, so the patient can sort of decide how far of a range they want to go. And then slowly working on building up that strength in the hip. And then making sure that they have had a meeting with their doctor about maybe some pharmacological management, because that osteoporosis sounds pretty severe.
Right. The next question, do you find that an individual needing a medical clearance can be a detriment to their joining classes?
I haven't had an issue with it. And so it depends on your organization, where you're getting the referrals from and how complex your patients are, I think. To me, it hasn't been a limiting factor, but I can totally appreciate how it might be, especially if the institution that you're working out of requires that medical clearance. But if you make that as part of the advertisement for your exercise class, hopefully older adults will have that opportunity to get medical clearance before they enroll.
Great. All right. And the next question, second to last, they thank you for such an insightful session. And they ask if you can shed some light on how you work with adherence of clients to exercises in the long term.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, because my PhD study did not pass our adherence requirements. So I haven't recognized it in practice myself. Some things that I have reflected on and thought about is trying to make the exercises more personal. So recognizing what people are already doing and trying to give them credit for that. So if somebody does really like walking, how can we build in some strengthening exercises into that routine? So I think that if you can work around some of the goals that they find important, choosing exercises and things that they enjoy, and not making it too overwhelming. So I think sometimes that helps. There's also a bit of a balance between people who like to exercise on their own versus people who like to do a group class. So if this is somebody who wants to be a part of a class, then maybe they just keep enrolling over time in some of these really great community programs that are out there. And if it's somebody who does prefer to work out at home on their own, then providing them with a really good home exercise program that they've maybe provided input onto would also be a good idea. So making sure you've tried the exercises with them, that they like them, and that they're willing to continue them.
Great. All right. Our last question is, do you think it's better to limit number of people per class so that we can promote more standing exercises versus sitting exercises? It seems like sometimes sitting exercises are preferred because of lack of supervision if class size is too big.
Such a great question, and I would. It's tricky because sometimes you're limited by your institution and not so much by your own preference as an exercise instructor, healthcare provider. I was fortunate enough to have the autonomy to develop my class, and I don't want more than 10 people in there. My preference is 8, and then I have myself and a volunteer, so it's sort of like a 4-to-1 ratio. And part of that is so that we can help to personalize the exercises, so that we can give sort of individual attention for each exercise. And then of course that safety piece. So making sure that people are able to exercise safely. So I prefer smaller group classes, but I know you're not always in control of that.
For sure. Thank you so much, Tina. Thank you for tackling all those questions. It was fantastic to see so many people engaged, so many questions. I know that you had a little bit of a chance to check out the chat, but just so you know, there were tons of words of thanks and really positive feedback for your presentation. So thank you again. It was so fantastic to have you. And I hope that everyone's still on the line. You have a fantastic afternoon. Again, the recording and the slides will be shared with the post-event package. Certificate of participation will also be sent to you, the email that you registered with. And we please do ask that you fill out the evaluation survey. Unless there's anything else, I will send us all on our way and say thank you again to Tina.
Thanks so much for having me, everybody, for your great questions and for being so engaged. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Tina. Bye, everyone.